think we might as well get started. Denise, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Oh, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Navigating the New Workplace as a Nonprofit Organization. This webinar is brought to you in partnership between Engaged HR and the United Way of Greater Victoria, and we're super excited to have you join us today. My name is Ari Epstein, and I'm the co-owner and CSO of Engaged HR. I'm also going to be your moderator today. A little bit about us. Engaged HR is a BC-based firm like no other. We provide HR solutions to organizations right across the country, including well over 150 not-for-profit organizations from coast to coast. We have a range of services that is really way too long to take up to discuss here. It's probably going to take up the entire hour, and we don't want to do that. So if you want to learn more, do reach out. We'd love to connect with you. Our partner today is the United Way of Greater Victoria. We're delighted to have Mark with us, Mark Breslauer, who's the CEO of the United Way of Greater Victoria. Mark, would you kindly say a few words about your organization?
Thank you very much, Ari, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to partner with Engaged HR in this what will be a very informative session. We at United Way have been very involved in community for years and years. All dollars that we raise and the impact that we make is local to the Greater Victoria region, and that's very important. This past year, which would have been our year end at the end of March, we impacted some 90,000 lives for the better, and it is our pleasure to do that very rewarding work. Clearly, it's a very different time. Through this pandemic, we launched an initiative called Local Love in a Global Crisis, and it is in response very directly to first stage response to the pandemic to ultimately get to recovery and rebuilding. One of the key areas of focus is to assist the not-for-profit sector, our partners, many of whom are on the call today, who assist those most vulnerable. So in speaking to Ari and Denise and the team at Engaged, this was a wonderful opportunity to offer something that can assist you. So a great pleasure to be here. Have a very informative session.
Thank you, Mark. Much appreciated. I'm constantly inspired by the amazing work that your organization does right here in the community. Thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit tech tips. We are going to be keeping everyone on mute this morning, so please keep that in mind. If you click the participant button, you can see who else is on the call though. Please use the Q&A area to ask questions. We're not going to be monitoring the chat area, so please use the Q&A area to ask any questions. And the questions are going to follow the presentation by Denise. This webinar is also being recorded, so it's going to be emailed to you, a link is going to be emailed to you, as well as a copy of the presentation slides. And the recording itself should be available sometime later this afternoon or at the latest first thing tomorrow morning, and you can view that right on our website at engagedhr.com. I also just want to do some quick little disclaimer that this presentation is focused on HR considerations to bring people back to work within the BC jurisdiction. And while many of the recommendations we provide today are really best practices that can be followed right across the country and beyond, we really are going to be focusing on the BC jurisdiction today primarily. The presentation is also provided as a free service to those in attendance and anyone who views the recording. As an HR professional services firm, the information provided today is not legal advice and should not be construed as such. A little bit about how we can help. HR and demand services, one thing that we do, a pay-as-you-go model for HR advising with any sort of questions you might have regarding bringing your workforce back to work, as well as many of our other services. We have a COVID dedicated webpage. There you'll find many of our past webinars, as well as blogs, memos, and other useful information and tips to assist your organizations in the day-to-day management of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also subscribe to the newsletter that way, and watch our social media channels as well for relevant shares. And our blogs, of course, are we've probably one of the most prolific bloggers in the HR sphere. As always, we're here for you with whatever HR needs you might have. I want to turn things over to my partner, the co-founder and CEO of Engaged HR, who will be leading us through this webinar. Denise is the founder and CEO of Engaged HR, and she's been in the human resources field for over 25 years. She's got a wide array of leadership experience, including founding Engaged HR, which is BC's largest provider of HR services in the not-for-profit sector. Denise's innovative and solution-focused approach creates great places to work. She holds a Master of Arts in Leadership from Laurel University and the prestigious designation of a fellow chartered professional in human resources. Welcome, Denise. Let me just,
I'll just unmute me. There we go.
Okay.
So thanks so much. It's always so awkward to hear people introduce you. So thanks for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to share so much information with all of you today. It is going to be a jam-packed session, and as Ari said, we are going to be sending you the slides, so don't worry about trying to write down everything that's being presented today, because it's a ton of information. I'm going to dive right in because time's moving quickly. So here's our agenda for today. We've got our time together to talk about bringing people back to work and being safe inside the workplace, and managing all the different components associated with managing in today's very different work environment than we've had in the past. And so wanted to really take an opportunity to walk through all of these different areas, because I know there's many questions on the top of your mind as we go through this. So to get us started, I'm going to pull up a poll. I'd like to know a little bit about the role that you play in your organization, so that we can really be clear on who's on the call. So Ari, I'm going to have you launch that poll. What role do you play in your organization? So if you can just highlight what role, and you might be approaching this from a couple of different places. Maybe you're a board member on one organization, but you work for a different organization. It's okay to answer more than once, perhaps. I'm not sure if the poll will let you do that or not. But I'm really curious what role you play inside the organization. So I can't tell whether people are voting. So Ari, I'm assuming you can tell, and you might be able to.
People are voting. It's been about 40 seconds. We'll give people another 10-15 seconds to vote. 88% of individuals have already voted, so we'll just wait for a few last attendees to vote, and then I will share the results with everyone as well. I'm sure you're probably going to be interested to learn what the results might be.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, I am going to end the polling right now.
Awesome. And
I'm going to share the results. So, as you can see, but 11% of us are board members. 23% are CEO/executive director, 19 are in a finance role, and 36%, the bulk, are program managers and coordinators, as well as 11% are frontline staff.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really helpful to know what perspective and what sort of lens that you're listening to today, so that as you take this back into your organization, I can share examples with you and stories with you that relate to positions that you might be in. Because one of the things that we're going to talk about as it relates to COVID-19 is what we can all do, because we're all in this together. And so I want to talk a little bit about the symptoms and transmission of COVID-19, really to set the stage, because we all are very aware of COVID-19 and what is it. And you don't need me, a non-health professional, to tell you what the symptoms are. But the BC Centre for Disease Control has indicated these symptoms. And they've also highlighted transmission, and transmission is where I want to focus, because the virus is transferred by droplets coming into contact with our eyes, nose, and mouth through close contact with other people and touching contaminated surfaces or people. So I speak about that because I want you to keep that transmission piece in your top of mind. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about and that you need to think about when it relates to COVID and safety in the workplace and bringing people back to work is that people should not be at work if they're exhibiting symptoms or they are ill. So we need to educate people on what to do if they are ill. And there's lots of different ways to do that. So you might have posters in your workplace. You might have an email that goes out to everyone so they know if they feel ill and what are the symptoms, that they have it at home, so they know, well, what am I supposed to do? Who do I call? How do I report into being sick? How do I say I'm either not coming to work or I'm working from home today because I'm feeling ill and I don't want to bring what I have into the workplace? And we are a society where typically we have soldiered on and we have come to work feeling ill. And that is no longer an acceptable behavior. It is unsafe to do that. And so we need to really help people realize that this is a new way of, a new level of acceptance, we'll say, about being sick and staying away from the workplace. We need to reiterate it and model it, and we need to remove barriers from people calling in sick. We don't call in sick if we think we're not going to get paid. So we need to remove those barriers and looking at our sick pay policies and our leave policies. And we're going to cover a lot more of that as we go through the presentation today. But I wanted to deal with this first because at the bottom line, people need to stay home if they're sick. And then if you know that that's happening, then everything else that we're going to talk about is on the assumption that people are not coming to work when they're sick and we're dealing with healthy individuals, and this is all the different things we'll do after that. Now I'm going to ask another poll question just to get a sense of where you're at from the nonprofit experience. I'm curious, and Ari, you can pop that next poll up, which is how has COVID-19 impacted you so far? Have you stayed open and you've been providing services throughout this pandemic period? Is everyone working at home and services are still being provided? Have you laid off some people and some people working from home? Have you closed your doors and you've laid off the majority of your staff? And if you have others, if there's other things that you've done, feel free to pop that into the chat. I know we said it's not going to be monitored, but I will take a quick look at that. As I do want to know, how has this impacted you so far? What has been your way of addressing the COVID-19 impact? And so we'll just leave that up for a second for people to give us some indication of, in your world today, how are you dealing with this?
Thanks, Denise. The poll is still open. There about 87% of you have already responded. Thank you so much. Just waiting for a couple more individuals to respond before we hopefully hit the 100% mark. And then I'll be sharing those results with you as well.
Great. And I see in the chat there, Jackie, you've stayed open, but you had to modify your services. So it's not business as usual necessarily. For Angela, close to clients and donations and all volunteers, and have only one part-time staff still working. Some frontline staff still working in the community, but administrative staff working at home. Repurposed your programs, emergency food distribution.
So I'm going to close the polling right now and share the results with everyone as well. Thank you everyone for voting. And there are the results. As you can see, the vast majority, 57% of you have been working from home and services continue to be provided apparently uninterrupted, which is really terrific to hear. But that also means that for 43% of you, things are not business not as usual. Well, I guess with the exception of 17% who stayed open and provided the same services. So about a third of you, 25%, have really seen a significant impact one way or another on the organization as well.
Well, and what I got from the chat and what I'm guessing is that there's people are working from home, services are being provided, but those services have probably changed, especially any in-person services. You may have made that pivot. We were using that word a lot over the last 8 weeks, but you've pivoted to virtual services perhaps, or you're doing drop-off type services versus in-person interaction. Similar to the restaurant industry that moved from having people sit in the dining room to doing takeout. Nonprofits, I've seen a lot of shifts to, instead of in-person counseling, we're doing virtual counseling. And so have really made whatever shift they need to in their service model. And that's one of the things I wanted to sort of address and what I'm calling the elephant in the room associated with being a nonprofit organization. That that is really required to still provide services to a community, and a community that is in crisis in a lot of ways, as we all are. And so one of the things I wanted to just sort of validate for people is, and to acknowledge, is just how hard this is, and that the impact to nonprofits is large, and there's so many different things to consider. It can be really overwhelming. And one of the things about today's webinar is that we are going to speak pretty generally about things, because impacts are different for every organization, and it's hard to be super specific with that. But some of the impacts that I'm sure you've seen, and the nonprofits that we're serving have seen, are things like, you know, your services are continuing, or you're pivoting, you've lost staff to layoff or illness, or just the inability to work, a loss of volunteers, and we're really seeing the lack of operational funding versus program funding being really problematic now, because you don't have the infrastructure you need to make these really important service delivery changes. And as a result, it's a difficult time for everyone, for the board, the staff, volunteers, and your clients. And I know for us, we experience this in that, you know, we serve organizations all across the country. We're used to having a few clients that have something going on and it's a bit crazy and there's a bit of a crisis, but everyone else is just, everything's ticking along great. And then COVID happens and everybody goes into chaos at the same time. And so now everyone's in chaos, including yourself, and because you're in that same environment as everyone else. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, it's important for all of us to take care of ourselves in this time. So let's talk about COVID and what does it mean, and what does this mean to your organization as you've been thrown into this state of uncertainty. The first thing I want you to think about as we really focus in on the HR side of managing this new workplace is I want you to really think about and take time to examine the work itself, because now is the time to shift whatever you're doing. So the good questions to ask yourself are things like, does your work have to be done in person? Do people have to come into work every day? Do employees need to be at their desk? Can they do this little bits? They come in every once in a while. Do they come in at all? Maybe they don't. What services can be done online? What services have become irrelevant, freeing up time to do more relevant services? And with summer coming, can we do more outside? So when you think about safety and you think about the employment that you have and the work that you have to do, these are some really good questions to ask yourself. And because what I want you to do now is I want you to manage the work environment and manage the employment relationship that is related to that. Because you need to know what you're planning for. If you think and look at your services and you look at your needs, and whether it's online, in person, inside, outside, you think about all of that, then that will help you manage what you need from your employees. Because you need to know, are you bringing them back to work and putting safety protocols in place? Or maybe you're returning to services in phases, or you have new services that you need and new skills that you need that don't currently exist on your team. Maybe it's a combination of things. Regardless of what you need to do, you need to manage this employment relationship, and you need to know whether you're going to continue to be able to employ people, whether you're moving into ending the employment relationship or changing the employment relationship. So one of the things that you might need to do, depending on how things went for your organization, is you might need to recall people from layoff. If people are on layoff right now, we are in a period in British Columbia where we have 16 weeks out of 20 is considered a temporary layoff. And so if you hit week 17, then, and you do nothing, you just leave people in layoff, then eventually you have essentially terminated that relationship. And severance rules apply, and you need to think of it as a termination. If you're bringing people back from layoff, then you need to think about, what are you going to be thinking about? What do you need? How do you create criteria that's really objective and non-discriminatory? How do you connect the skills you need to the work that you want to do, both for today, but also for the future? Because now is the time to be thinking more than that immediate need of next week, but thinking about, how are we going to manage over the summer? What do we know about the fall? And one of the things about nonprofit organizations is that you may have enough funding right now, and your funding model may change as the government makes its decisions about where it's putting its money. And that's a future issue. it may not be hitting you right now. You may have some donations may be going down, some of your funding may be changing, but some may still be in place. And it's as you look at your next window, that might be where you need to think about your future layoffs. And in that case, if you're needing to do layoffs, then ideally you have employee consent to do that. Currently in our Employment Standards Act, there is what's considered an unforeseen event clause, which allows you to initiate a layoff without making any payment to an employee. The COVID-19 has been deemed to be an unforeseen event, and that is a temporary allowance within the Employment Standards Act that will not be there forever. Eventually, what happens to an organization will no longer be deemed to be because of COVID. It will just be the nature of our economy. And that window and that opportunity within the Employment Standards Act will go back to normal, where you would, if you were to, essentially there is no layoff clause in BC. If you move someone to less than 50% of their wages, they are essentially terminated. So you want to think about whether acting now when you are still under a COVID unforeseen event clause is better for your organization or not. And of course, you always want to consider the needs of the employee as well, because there's lots of programs right now that are, again, because of COVID, that may be beneficial for an employee if you see a layoff coming down the line. A sooner than later approach might be better. It's, again, all about taking a look at both your short-term and your long-term needs. Now, all of this work within what is going on right now is redefining people's jobs. And you need to consider the nature of the work. Are things changing dramatically? If they are changing dramatically, then you need to think about how you're working with your employees on that, especially if they're still working and they haven't been laid off and they're doing their work differently. Now, some differently type work is happening because of COVID, and it's strictly because of COVID, and your intention is to go back to where things were beforehand. And so you would like, in an ideal situation, you'll document those changes and you document that they're temporary. So people know this is just an all hands on deck situation. We're responding in a crisis and we're doing what we need to do for the organization. But the nature of my work is not changing permanently. If, however, you have permanent changes that you want to make in the defining of a job, then it's important to revise the job description and make sure that you're not changing the terms and conditions of employment so dramatically that an employee feels what's called constructively dismissed. That basically you haven't made their job so untenable that they had no choice but to quit. You want to make sure that you're changing the nature of the job is fine. It just can't be so dramatic that it's like, oh, I used to, be a counselor and now I'm a cook. The skill sets are totally different. The work is totally different. That is a different job altogether. And so if you're in situations in your nonprofit where you have to change things very dramatically, then you need to renegotiate your employment agreements. And there's some legal ramifications to that and something called additional consideration that you'd want to consider and want to ensure that you incorporate it into that renegotiation. And knowing that if an employee does return to work after the change and after you've told them about the change, they are deemed to have accepted the change. So there's a number of ramifications to that. So you want to make sure, the thing I want you to walk away with this is that when you're redefining jobs, because your work has changed so dramatically, you want to make sure that you're considering the legal ramifications of that in the employment relationship. Now, we all have a job to do in managing organizations and in making sure that we are taking the management and the safety components associated with creating the right kind of workplace in this new world really seriously. And so it's a time for everyone to step in because everyone has to take this seriously. If you have people in your organization that are not taking the new normal and the seriousness of the situation to heart, then it's a sign that you need to do even more communication than perhaps you were before about what it is that people need to do, how they need to work with the organization to make sure that everything that you're putting in place is being followed. And each role within the organization has a role to play, has a responsibility. The board is ultimately responsible because they are the employer, and it is the employer's job to create a safe workplace. And so ultimately, while the board isn't necessarily the ones doing the work to create safety, they are the ones that have to be able to say, with full confidence that the organization is doing what it needs to be safe. So they do have a role to play. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that need to be created in order to help each of these roles, because there's a lot to do. And training becomes even more important than it ever has been before, because none of us have ever gone through this before. There's so much that we haven't even really understood yet about this environment and what it means to be safe. And so the more training you can do, the more communication you can have, the more conversations you have, the better for the organization, because everyone will start to feel more adjusted to the new normal when they have information and training available to them. So you need to consider the training needs of all the different places. One of the training that I wanted to mention is the Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee training. If you don't have an Occupational Health and Safety Committee, now is a good time to have one. In some cases, you are mandated to have one because you are a certain size in the organization, and so WorkSafeBC requires it. They offer great free training to help organizations understand what does that committee do, what are their responsibilities. So I've put that in the resources page at the end to make sure you have a connection to that free training. So you're open again. Everything, you've made your decisions, you know who's coming back to work, you know how work is going to look. How do you make it safe? So the first thing I suggest that you do is you set up a task force. And that task force has clearly defined responsibilities, because no one person should be responsible for the safety. No one person can be. Everyone is responsible for safety. And it can be really helpful if you have a task force, because it increases the amount of communication that happens. And the more you communicate, the easier it is to make sure that you are working together and not, you can have one person who thinks, oh, well, my department can come back to work. Nobody else is going to be in the building. We'll be able to physically distance. And then you have another department that plan to do the exact same thing. You show up on the exact same day at the exact same time, and now you're no longer able to physically distance. If communication had happened, if there was a task force that was managing and making sure that this was happening, lots of those kinds of situations wouldn't arise. In that task force, you want to include your Joint Health and Safety Committee, and you want to think about both a short-term and long-term. And I'm going to go back to and link you back to training. Training. WorkBC has created a great safety plan. They have a template of which resources are linked at the end of the presentation. And they're basically saying there's 6 steps. The first thing you need to do to create your safety plan, and WorkSafeBC has been very clear. Every organization has to have a safety plan. It needs to be posted. And if an inspector were to arrive, you would be able to hand it over clearly written down to say, here's our safety plan. WorkSafeBC is increasing their inspections, so you do want to make sure that you're complying so that you're able to, if they were to show up at your door, to confidently say, we've done all that we're supposed to do. So the first thing you do is assess the risks in your workplace. And my next slide is going to talk about what those risks, how to do that. Then you implement protocols to reduce the risk. We're going to talk about how you do that. Then you develop a policy. Well, there's lots of us in nonprofit know exactly what program policies are like. And so this is very similar to a program policy. You write policies around how you're going to stay safe, develop a communication plan and do training, monitor and make sure that you're making updates as you need. And you continue to address any risks that come once you get started. So everybody comes back and now you find there's things you hadn't thought of before. Well, that needs to get updated. And so now you go back to the beginning, assess the risk, implement a protocol, develop a policy. So it's when you really get down to the bottom line, it's a very clear sort of safety plan associated with managing this. Very similar to lots of risks that I'm sure you've thought about in your organization as well. So how do you assess risk? Well, WorkSafeBC has shared this matrix associated with impact and probability. And so when you look at your probability, ranging from rare to very likely, and your impact from minor to extreme, you can see where things start to have some alignment. And so if you go back to the very first slide where we talked about symptoms and transmission, if you think about transmission is being in close contact with other people or having contact with surfaces and other people, then you apply your risk. What is the likelihood of transmission? Is it minor and rare? Well, then your action, your prioritization, what you're going to do to resolve that might be far less than what you might do if probability of exposure is very high and the impact is extreme. You're going to prioritize that area, that quadrant area. You're going to create things that are going to minimize the risk so that it goes from, the probability goes from very likely to rare. You're going to do whatever you can to move everything to minor and rare. You want to assess your risk and create an action. What do you need to do? Document that so that when WorkBC asks to see your plan, it's all really clear. And you're involving your task force so that when you are working your plan, the task force is aware of where things are and how things are going. Ultimately, the safety is your number one thing that you're concerned about, and both physical safety and psychological safety. And we're going to talk about both of those, and certainly the mental health side is equally as important. But I want you to think about that risk assessment in relation to the hierarchy of controls. So this is also a WorkSafe tool. The hierarchy of controls is helping you identify how do you eliminate the risk, if you can, or if nothing else, how can you reduce it? The most effective way to reduce risk is eliminate the risk. And you do that by having people work from home, for example. So when I asked you, do people really need to come back to work? Can they stay at home? Can they stay at home most of the time? That's the elimination of the risk. But if you can't have that as your reality and people are coming together, then what are the things you need to look at to help manage that risk? Engineering controls is the next thing. So these are things that are your physical barriers. So we've seen these already showing up in lots of different places. We've seen them with the plexiglass in the cashiers when you go to the grocery store. So plexiglass is an engineering control because it's a physical barrier. It's something that's been created to manage the risk of the customer and the cashier being really close together. You see it in enhanced cleaning and sanitizing. We're cleaning more often. We're being aware of things. And I'm going to go through what all those things look like. The physical barriers are also things, I think the plexiglass is probably the most prevalent one. The administrative, cleaning and disinfecting is in there. More so on the administrative side is the policy associated with it, is the protocols. How often are you doing it? Who's responsible for it? How do you make sure that you don't have 12 people crammed into a meeting room, that your meeting rooms have no more than 3 people, if that's the most you can fit in there, that can still be 2 meters apart. And so your administrative controls are all your policies, and it's things like, like nobody is sharing equipment, that everybody has their own headset, their own keyboard and computer tools. So those are the policy pieces, and documenting that as much as possible is really important. And then the last control, which is actually the least effective control, is your PPE, your personal protective equipment. And the crazy thing about this is we hear about PPE all the time as if it is the be-all and end-all to ending COVID. But it is actually very helpful in environments where you are right up in with the virus itself. So it's very important for essential service workers and these people, but in your everyday at work kind of environment, if you've reduced your risk with other controls, then things like non-medical masks might be important in your environment, but gloves not so much, because they're not actually going to help you. So going straight to PPE as your solution isn't necessarily going to help if you haven't done all the other pieces that go with the hierarchy of controls. So I want you to keep this in mind, and I know I'm giving you a lot of information here, but I want you to keep this hierarchy and controls in mind when we think about physical safety. So the physical safety areas are things like your building, your individual work areas, common areas like washrooms and break rooms and the kitchen, that kind of thing, and also outside the actual workplace, because we now have people working at home, and the home has become the new workplace. In your building, again, think about things with a transmission lens. What do we need to touch? Where do we need to be together? How can we remove those pieces? And this is where a lot of physical engineering controls will come into play. Installing plexiglass, putting floor marking on your floors so people know which way to walk, ensuring doors don't have to be open, they can be propped open, you don't have to touch a doorknob, installing things like touchless faucets and touchless light switches, posting signage everywhere, explaining the rules, and stopping people coming into the office because they may, again, you want to lower the amount of people you have contact with. In individual work areas, common work areas, or areas where you have clients coming in, where you have volunteers working, again, you want to think about transmission from people and surfaces. So you're enhancing your cleaning measures. You've got hand sanitizer everywhere. You've got adequate hand washing supplies, soap and towels, and ways to dispose of the towels. No sharing of equipment. You're cleaning your equipment, and you're looking at your physical distancing. No people talking at a desk together because they're too close. No in-person meetings unless your room is large enough. No shared offices. You have to start thinking about things like staggering shifts, staggering lunch breaks, making sure people are not congregating together in too tight of a space. And you've got your common areas, stairwells, washrooms, the reception desk, anything that you share. So I know in our office, we have a shared printer, which everybody touches, which also has a shared stapler and a stapler remover and a hole punch. And all of those shared things can no longer be shared because too many hands on the material increases transmission. So all the same principles apply to all of these common areas as well. Bottom line is the importance of hand washing. You need to always be washing your hands, and you need to remind people 1,000,000 times a day that they need to be washing their hands. Signs, posters, whatever you need to put up. And there's lots of things that have been created now by the provincial government and by WorkSafeBC. Posters you can print out, pop up on the wall. You don't need to do any work. Now, there are lots of provincial directives and resources out there. WorkSafeBC has been pumping out material like crazy, and I've got 2 pages of resources for you, or 2 slides of resources for you at the end with lots of links. Provincial Health Office is doing a lot of production of material, and any other provincial health and safety departments, depending on what province you're in. And there's lots of directives by industry. Childcare has one by the Provincial Health Office. WorkSafeBC has a ton based on all the different industries and the different places that you need to be thinking about when it comes to your specific industry. Community Social Service Employers Association and Community Living BC have also put out some great information. So depending on what type of industry you're in the nonprofit sector, those may be sources of information for you. And the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety has some excellent free tip sheets, industry-wide as well as more generalized, also awesome. And so I've put some resources for you in the resources page on that as well. So there's lots of information out there. The thing is to do a little bit of research, find a few resources, and then implement. So one of the things we can run into is the analysis paralysis phase. And so we get a lot of information and we source all kinds of stuff and we don't implement. And this train has left the station, we have to start implementing. So, take a look at some of the things that are most relevant to you and then start your process and start your plan, assess your risk, and get things out there. Now, as I mentioned, the workplace has changed, and as all of you know, there's lots of people working from home now. And when we went home, in the middle of March, we thought we were going home for a couple of weeks, and then this would all be over, and we'll be back to normal, and everything would be fine. And that hasn't happened. And so we went home, not realizing that working from home was going to be for months on end, if not permanently. And so there are some obligations on the employer's part to start looking at as it relates to having people working at home, because the home becomes the workplace when it is a permanent or a very frequent situation. So WorkSafeBC has indicated you do need to have work from home, WFH policies that have an employee doing a safety assessment of their home and helping you understand, have they done things like looked at their ergonomics? Have they looked at their lighting and their equipment? Have you made sure that they are safely able to work at home? And have you documented in policy how to report any workplace injury that happens at home? And so it's shining a whole different light on actually working at home, where before it was a perk. Every once in a while you could work at home and it was no big deal. And we didn't really need the same rigor that we do now when it comes to having work at home policies. Documentation is key. And the other thing to keep in mind with work from home policies is that you may have people who are working alone or in isolation because they live alone. Lots of us have spouses or kids at home, and so this isn't an issue. And we don't want to forget about those that work alone. You have an obligation from WorkSafe to have a check-in procedure for staff that work alone. It needs to be indicated what your time intervals are and what happens if they don't check in. So if an employee goes, AWOL for a few days and doesn't check in, what do? You need to have a procedure outlined for what happens. So you want to make sure that you have up-to-date emergency contact information for everyone. And because you may find that with the work from home model that becomes more relevant for you. I do have a link to a work from home checklist in the resources for you to help with those work from home policies. So we're working at home. We're by ourselves potentially. We are in a whole different world than we were in 8, 9, 10 weeks ago. And this is impacting our mental health. And so I just want to talk about some of the social, psychological safety sides of things. So some studies have been done already. The Mental Health Commission of Canada is reporting that 40% of Canadians are acknowledging mental health challenges in the last month. Typically, that's been 20%. You are probably seeing this in an increased demand for your services. As nonprofits, when we're experiencing mental health challenges, you are the people we reach out to in lots of cases. And so I'm sure this is not a surprise. People are worried about their finances and potential job loss as a result of the pandemic. And a primary driver of the stress is actually fear of contracting the virus, either themselves or a family member. So I want you to keep that in mind because that's important when it comes to getting people back to work and helping people feel comfortable at work. Stressful times call for additional care and attention by the employer. So it's something for us to consider. So how do we address this fear? This primary driver of stress is a fear of contracting the virus. So how do we address the fear? Well, first we have to educate on what measures are you required to do and how are you meeting those requirements. Information, share your information, let them know what you've done. I'm going to go back to training. Implement mandatory training on all new safety measures. We are all responsible to keep everyone safe. This is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. Signage is a helpful reminder, and it builds confidence that others will know what to do and will be reminded to do it as well. Keep the lines of communication open and be very clear. How does someone report if something's not being followed? How do they help you manage all the safety protocols that are in place? And when something comes up, do something about it. You will not get this perfect. There's no way you will get this perfect because we don't all know everything there is to know about how to deal with this. So employees need to be empowered to help. How can reporting become a helpful thing instead of a fearful thing? And communicate internally what you're doing, but also externally, because as employees are being supported with all the things that you're doing, they will feel better. Customers, clients, people who are using your services are also going to feel better using your services, knowing what you're doing. And if they feel comfortable, they're not going to be bringing their fear into the employee. The employee then has to manage their fear while they're also feeling fearful. So if everybody is feeling comfortable with what you've done to address the safety side of things, then everybody's emotional stress starts to go down. May not eliminate it, but it will start to go down. So checking in with staff is important. Have conversations, ask questions, and really listen and give employees a voice. You want to have a conversation. And one of our partners, Sean Rabel, shared this in a webinar we did a couple weeks ago on mental health and employee well-being. And he shared this quadrant tool of having a conversation and bringing up for people what you know, what you hear and see, what you feel, and what you need. And it gives space in the discussion for the employees to trust and share, because you're being very clear about what it is that you are seeing and how that makes you feel and what you need from the employees. So this is a great tool for checking in on performance, but also just checking in on how they're doing, especially if you're seeing things and feeling things that they're struggling, and it's time to have a conversation about that. Also, in your check-ins, post information about EAP and other health and wellness programs so they don't have to ask. Not everybody is going to admit that they're struggling, and so having information widely and easily accessible makes it so much easier. Increase your wellness activities, your information sharing. Provide information to parents, for example, who are trying to navigate, not being able to have kids go to school in order to get their jobs done. And be careful to manage your expectations on performance and productivity, because we're not at our best right now. We are without a doubt struggling. There are days we are unmotivated and unproductive because this is just a crazy world we're in right now. So sometimes that means employees aren't showing up. And so you need to look at the legitimacy of the absence. Is it actually unsafe for them to do their work? And so they are unable to come to work because it's unsafe. Or are employees absent or unproductive for other reasons, and you need to look at how to support them. Whether it's, we've talked about, they're ill and you need to manage some paid sick time or vacation time. Maybe they need a leave of absence, and under employment standards, there's a job protected COVID leave, which is an unpaid leave, but it protects their job. It allows them to take some time off to manage. Maybe it's to help for their own illness or to help manage the illness of someone that's in their caregiving responsibilities. You may need to accommodate as well. You might need to talk about how to help them manage their life, because life and work has become very intertwined. In some cases, I've heard of examples where people are staggering shifts so people can manage childcare. Maybe both parents are working and the kids are at home, and so shifts are staggered to make sure that there's always childcare is being taken care of. You're allowing people to bring their kids to work, and especially if they're in a single office and the child is with the parent in their office, it's still, physical distancing is not an issue, and it's okay for them to be there. So these are the things you need to think about before rushing to performance is suffering and they're not pulling their weight. You need to look at what are some of the things that could be going on and how can we help. And you also, as the manager, as the people that are thinking about this, as you're reaching out and supporting your team, don't go it alone. Bring your team with you. Reach out for support where you need it. We are all in this together, and no one person should be bearing the weight. And so make sure that you are getting as much self-care for yourself as those that you are supporting. Now, I just want to take, I know we're running short on time, I just want to take a couple minutes and just quickly talk about some business continuity and sustainability things. It's time to put our scrutiny glasses on, because I know this is just the beginning. The one thing that we're really clear about is that there is a high chance of a second wave, and so how do we make sure that we're ready? So how do we create a succession plan and a continuity plan? What if key positions get sick? What if there's a second wave? Have we done enough cross-training? Start building your casual labor pool now so that if people get sick, you've got people to call in. Get ready for permanent work from home models. This came at us unexpected and we didn't see it coming. We know that more is coming. This is not the end. And so how do we get ready? How do we look at our financial plan? How do we look at the wage subsidy? Let's do some scenario building for the next 12 to 24 months. Knowing that working notice is your best strategy for mitigating financial loss. If you think your funding model is going to change in the spring of 2021, then in the fall of 2020, you're doing some work around working notice for layoffs. There's a great business continuity publication in the Canadian Council on Occupational Health. I've included a link there for you. You will get the slides when we send this out, so that will be a tool that you can examine. Now, with all of this WorkSafe focus, we've been very focused on WorkSafe in this presentation, I also want to remind you, you do still have to manage your legal liability on all the other things we have to pay attention to. And if you are accredited, if you are in any kind of collective agreement situation, you have lots of other bodies to pay attention to. If you're a licensed daycare provider, you've got licensing to take care of. I know there's other legislations that are also telling you what to do, but I don't want you to forget about the employment ones. And the employment ones are your Employment Standards Act, your Workers' Compensation Act, which we've talked about extensively, your Personal Information and Protection Act, particularly if you get into temperature screening. That's a whole other legal area that we haven't touched on, but it does relate to personal information, and the Human Rights Act. And one of the things, I saw a report from the BC Human Rights Commissioner who said, you know, there haven't been human rights cases about COVID-19 yet because not enough time's gone by, but when it does come up, if employees are being discriminated against in any way because they were sick with COVID, they do consider COVID, the Human Rights Commissioner sees being ill with COVID-19 as potentially being a disability. And so that would require accommodation. You wouldn't rush to termination or to discriminatory action in any way under the BC Human Rights Act. So I just want to remind you of those obligations. Now, the number one question that comes up is, what if someone won't come to work? What if people refuse to return? Now, it can be because they don't feel safe. And if they don't feel safe, now's the time to get really, really curious. You have to ask 100 questions. What is it that makes them feel unsafe? Communicate what you've done to make it safe. You know, we went back to all of those plans you've done, all that training you've done. Work to address to what makes them feel unsafe. Maybe they have a situation that you don't realize is happening in their day-to-day job and you haven't addressed it. Once you understand it and you know about it, you can address it. So that you have to get curious. And if they say the workplace is unsafe, you have an obligation to investigate it. You can, there's a 4-step process to WorkBC to investigating an unsafe claim. We're not going to go into it, but it's important that you examine it at least internally and identify if you can accommodate it, because it may not be the workplace. Sometimes it's other things. You know, I take the bus to get to work, or I have an elderly, vulnerable person at home, and so I can't be exposed. And so you need to look at how can you accommodate that employee. And there's lots of different ways, and we talked a little bit about some of it. And you need to talk about their options. And there does get to be a point where there are consequences of not returning to work. You've done everything you possibly can, depending on the reason why they're refusing to return to work. And you need to ask yourself, you know, at the end of the day, you're treating everybody equally, and everybody's case is their own, and everybody's situation is unique. And so as you've examined everything from, you know, very reasonable place, then you need to decide how much you want to maintain the relationship, and whether there are consequences to them not being able to return to work. And you're stepping into a lot of legal area there in terms of terminations, which we don't have time to get into. I'm going to end by saying everything you do needs to be documented. Document, 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 because there will come a time when you need to show those documents, and there will come a time where you need to refer back to them and say, we made a certain decision, and let's refresh our memories on why we made the decision we did. And if we have to shut down again, you're going to have your tools right there ready to go to say, this is how we do it, and it's all going to be nicely laid out for you. So documentation is king right now. Make sure you do it more than anything else. Make sure you document. These are 2 pages of resources that are going to come to you when we send out the slides. So lots of information there for you of all the different things that I've talked about. And we're time for questions. And I know I've taken a little bit longer than I wanted because I had so much I wanted to share with you. So I'm going to turn it back to Ari to manage us through the question period. So over to you.
Right. Yeah, that's a ton of useful information. I could tell just by the comments of people. Everyone was asking, generally speaking, are we are we going to get all this information? How are we going to keep up? Yes, like Denise mentioned, we are going to be sharing both the video and the slides of today's event with everyone in attendance today. And by all means, feel free to share this information with your friends and colleagues in the not-for-profit world as well. There are some questions that I wanted to get to before we end today. The first one came from Jackie Cox-Ziegler. My staff say PPE, especially masks, are too hot, so we made them optional. They're often within 2 meters of each other, and we have no additional cooling options. But what's an employer to do when there's this sort of a challenge where there's no opportunity to create that 2 meter separation? PPEs are admittedly uncomfortable. They're also one of the most reliable methods of prevention of transmission, yet they are one of the methods that WorkSafeBC does recommend. Well, how would you deal with something like this?
And I think if you can take a look at the type of mask they're wearing, certainly an N95 mask is way harder on your face than a cloth mask. Again, what we're hearing from medical officers right now, Dr. Tam and Dr. Henry, are that masks are helpful when you are unable to physically distance. So, if you're getting your hair cut, you're wearing a mask because that person is right close to you. If you're in an office where you're on either side of the room and you've got 2 meters within each other, then maybe a mask isn't necessary. But maybe it is if you're going to get up and walk from your desk to the printer area or to the washroom or the kitchen. You're going to have to go in amongst other people. Maybe then that's when you put on your mask. So it's not you're wearing it 24/7, but you're wearing it when you need to. And so then it lessens the heat factor. And different people are going to make different choices as well about whether masks are necessary. If you are within that 2 meters of each other, it will depend on what your line of service is and what people are doing. But I would look for other alternative masks that are perhaps not made, they're made with a lighter material, especially as we head into summer. You'll see masks that are being made that are much cooler, just naturally, versus a more robust and tight full mask.
Thanks for that, Denise. Next question is from Julie. It's a fascinating question. If staff has been laid off, should we still be checking in with them? What is the nature of their relationship that employers have with staff that have been laid off?
Yeah, I would definitely check in with your staff. I've heard some great stories of people that are still doing, they might do like a Zoom potluck lunch where people, they offer all their laid off staff an opportunity to join in on a Zoom call, and everybody brings their lunch and they talk about what they're having for lunch and they stay connected. You are still in an employment relationship with people who are laid off. And so they are still your employees. They still report to you. You are still in relationship with them. And so absolutely doing a check-in of some kind, even if it's an email that says, been thinking about you and how are you, or an email that updates people so they know what your situation is, what your plans are, still very helpful. So I would definitely do check-ins. You want them to come back, and you want them to come back and have missed you. And so taking care of them while they're laid off is still important.
Thanks for that, Denise. The next question is from, pardon me, Jane Arnold. How do you accommodate a variety of circumstances while addressing staff's sense of perhaps unequal work demands? It's a very, very tough question.
It is. And I had conversations with someone the other day about this because not every job is impacted negatively by COVID. Some jobs are more demanding now than ever. If you're a counselor, you're probably doing even more counseling appointments than you did in the past. Or if you're an administrator, you're in finance and you're the person running payroll. Your work is not lessened. You still have the same number of staff working. They're just working at home. You're still busy. Where other program staff may have a lot less to do because programs aren't running. Feel free to redeploy your staff in other areas. Make sure people have a feeling of being able to contribute meaningful work during this time. So you might have a program coordinator or a program administrator whose programs aren't running right now. Maybe they're on your task force and they're helping you with your safety protocols to come back to work. Maybe they're writing some policy, or maybe they're going to do some development of a training program for the volunteers about how to stay safe. Get people to help you in other ways versus having people say, well, my programs aren't running, so I don't have anything to do. because people want meaningful work. And so finding a way to get them to help you contribute to some of the new work that you're going to have to do might help that balance that out a little bit.
Thanks for that, Denise. The next question is from Aja or Aya. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. In regards to shared offices, what about job share arrangements? The employees share the office, but not on the same days, and high touch points are disinfected twice daily. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it sounds like a good plan. Certainly, the question is if you're bringing people off from layoff on a part-time job versus a full-time job, because they can only come to the office a few days a week, whether you're changing the employment relationship as a result of a job office sharing, or whether it's I work at home 2 days and I come into the office 2 days, then certainly if you're disinfecting the office in between, it's safe for them to share an office. You might want to have separate keyboards and separate mouse or headset versus shared equipment. But certainly if you're disinfecting the equipment and you've got that overnight period in between people coming to the desk itself, then you are probably safe.
Our final question in this Q&A session is from Julie Chambers. If we're checking in with them and the employee is not responding, where do we go from here? This is a very common question we've been hearing recently. Denise?
Yeah, I think there needs to be some authenticity in the check-in, and it's, haven't heard from you and concerned about you. Can you just let me know you're okay? Particularly in this time where people have been getting ill. And so, having that check-in. But in terms of if they're not participating in any of the social things that you're planning, or generally they're not participating, they aren't working. So technically they don't need to, but I would shift my approach a little bit and look at more of a personal check-in. You also want to make sure that they're mentally okay, that they're feeling okay, and that they're getting some support. So I would move away a little bit from the just like how you do and check in to I'm now getting worried about you. Can we have a conversation? And just do a check-in that way. And if at the end of the day, if they don't respond, they don't respond. You can't compel them in any way to respond.
Nice. Let's do one other question. Just give me one last second, so we'll see if we can answer that as well. And that is from an anonymous attendee. Hello, anonymous. Good to see you again. Do you have any advice on motivating a group where almost everyone in the non-for-profit is a volunteer? I'm seeing a lot of inertia and wait-and-see attitudes. So it's a very common question. Obviously, we hear.
Yeah.
How do you motivate groups in non-for-profit, specifically volunteers?
I think it's important to go back to the why and the mission and vision values of your organization, and to reinforce for them that they still have the opportunity to impact the mission of the organization, and helping them help you find ways to do that. If it's just a wait and see attitude about COVID, well, we're all waiting and seeing. And so it's moving off of that and moving back to the real reason why they got involved with your organization in the first place, and help them re-envision that, help them reconnect to that. And at a certain point, especially in a voluntary environment, they may not have the same ability to contribute that they had before, because of all the other things that might be going on. And so doing a check-in with people to see, they may just not know how to say, I just can't do this anymore. So having some open, transparent conversations one-on-one with them, not just in the group. But go back to your why and get them to reconnect to the why.
Thanks, Denise. That's terrific. Absolutely. They became volunteer for a reason, because they had passion about the mission of the organization, and hopefully that passion hasn't changed. Just how it's being delivered, that's being changed.
Absolutely.
We're at the end of our Q&A session, and almost at the end of the webinar. Before we let you go, and before we hear back from Mark for some just closing words about this webinar and about some next steps or some ideas and thoughts, I do want to ask you one last question through a poll, and that is how valuable this webinar is and was worth your time. It's really important for us to get your feedback, to know how we're doing, and that helps us better focus and better strategize for our subsequent and future webinars. So very much appreciate your participation in this poll. I'm going to open it up for about 1 minute right now.
So before we pass it over to Mark, also want to say thanks to everybody for participating and for putting up with my very, very fast talking, and look forward to your feedback, and also really just want to honor everybody that's still offering services and able to participate in working in our community. So we have such a soft spot and believe so much in the nonprofit sector. So I just really want to honor everybody that's working really hard to serve our communities. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Denise. Thank you everyone who's voted so far. Very much appreciate it. I'm going to end the polling now and turn it over to Mark.
Thank you again, Ari and Denise. I think my lead-in comments were we can expect a very informative session. I have to change the descriptor to super informative. So thank you, Denise. So much information, and the fact that we'll have reference materials after is invaluable. Again, we're delighted to partner with Engage. I thank all participants for your time. I hope you found it super informative. I know we were out on social media giving some little excerpts along the way, and social media is certainly a great avenue to provide feedback. Provided please to engage. You can email me at mark.breslauer@uwgb.ca as to other topics you'd like to see. You're a critical stakeholder group for us. That's the work we do within community. And so hope you found it beneficial. But my personal thanks to Ari, Denise, and team at Engage for a great offering here today. And we look forward to future engagements.
It sounds great. I would love to do some more of this. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Very much appreciate your participation in this as well. Before we do let you go, finally, just a quick contact information for Denise. We're also going to share Mark's contact information. I know Mark gave it to you verbally here, but in case you hadn't written down, we'll make sure to share Mark's contact information in the email that we sent together with the slides for the event as well. I want to thank everyone for sharing your past hour and a bit with us. We are going to be planning more webinars in the future, so do check in with us, check our website. Our resources are continuously updated, and we are going to continue to be, as best we can be, the voice of HR right here in Vancouver Island. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Denise, and
thanks, Ari.
for all attendees. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.